The more that I play Last Epoch, and the more that I talk to new players on Twitch, on YouTube, and on Discord, the more I find myself repeating these words over and over. You only get to be a new player once. Last Epoch, it's a wonderful game, and one of the greatest strengths that it has is that it's a new player-friendly game. Don't let that be lost on you. Last time that I created a video like this was for the 0.9 patch right before multiplayer came out, and the reception for that video was very, very good. The first 30 seconds of that video was rehashing the exact same point here. You don't need a build guide. I understand. I've played Path of Exile before, and I've been a new player in Path of Exile before. I played other action RPGs where I felt like I bricked my build and I needed to start over, and I wish I would have had a better start. That might be something that you feel in Last Epoch as well. I understand, because you're conditioned to feel that way from the other games you played. However, Last Epoch is a new player-friendly game. You can just jump in the game without reading a build guide, and you will have fun for a very long time. There's a caveat that I'm going to give you up front before we talk about build guide recommendations. If you choose to go that route, if you're a brand new player to do that thing, the one caveat that I'll tell you is don't respec your primary source of damage. If you want to try your own build, if you want to mess around and just level up and do the stuff that you enjoy, my recommendation is if you have 4 points or 5 points or 6 points in your primary skill, don't unspec your primary skill. You have 5 skill slots as you're leveling up. You'll have 1, 2, and 3 that are unlocked pretty early in the game. As you unlock your second skill slot, for example, use your second skill slot to experiment with a new skill and see if that jives with you. Don't unspec your primary source of damage, because if you do, you'll leave yourself in a power vacuum where you won't have the same power that you did 30 seconds ago. So that's my only recommendation for you if you want to go on it your own. If you're looking for a perfect min-maxed endgame build planner that you can perfectly copy and have an excellent S-tier build without any further planning or min-max beyond that point, this is not the video for you. This video will not contain that information. As a very simple example, I'm going to recommend some bleed builds here. If you played Last Epoch before, you know that there's a number of bleed unique items. There's a unique shield called Flayer's Pride. It's very good for shield-based bleed builds. I'm not going to recommend it. You can get that if you want it. You can farm it up. You can min-max your build beyond the point that I give it to you. But I'm not going to put that in the build guide because it's not essential to the build. There's another item called Valyr's Chalice. It's somewhat rare. It's a very good bleed item. It's a unique relic that you can equip to your character. It's excellent, and I would probably include it in basically any bleed-based character that I play. However, I'm not going to put it in the build guide because it's not mandatory. When I give these build guides to you, I want you to understand that you don't need those unique items. You'll get them, you'll find them, and if you don't, then you'll farm them up intentionally. And if you want to find better ways of min-maxing your characters, you can look things up on lastepochtools.com, you can look things up on maxroll.gg, you can even look up better build guides that have more min-max precision in them than this, because these are starter guides. Basically, every build in the game might want to consider using a 2x2 idol called Throne of Ambition because it gives you more damage if you're fire or cold damage, and it also gives you more armor against bosses. I'm not going to recommend it because if you know it exists, you know it exists. And if you don't know it exists, you will eventually. You'll get to that point if you keep playing. It's not essential to any of the characters you play. Speaking quickly of hardcore versus softcore, there's actually very few differences between hardcore and softcore in Last Epoch. I used to play exclusively hardcore. I think hardcore is a wonderful playstyle for Last Epoch, disregarding the servers because we don't know about servers and servers, hardcore, online play, who knows. But if you're willing to put up with this fact that you're playing an online thing, hardcore is good. Hardcore is really fun. There's only one build on this list that I would not recommend, and it would be the Marksman. The Marksman looks to be very squishy, especially with the nerf that we just saw to a couple things in the Marksman-based defenses, specifically Arrow Guard, the unique quiver. So other than Marksman, I think everything here would be totally fine for playing in hardcore. And I guess before we jump into these 14 build guides that I'm recommending, you might note that there are 15 masteries available to you when you load up Last Epoch. You have your 5 base classes and 5x3 for 3 of the mastery classes for each is 15. I'm recommending 14 builds. There's one mastery that I'm actually not going to recommend. 1, because it's funny, and 2, because I'm pretty sure it's true as well. It doesn't really fulfill any particular fantasy. It's kind of boring, doesn't really have a niche, and I think there's just better options out there. It might not be the one you think. We'll get to that point, I promise. But without further ado, let's jump into our 14 build guides that we're recommending for the 1.0 patch of Last Epoch on February 21st, 2024. Let's get started. The very first mastery that we'll be looking at is a Lich. So Lich is a acolyte. It distinguishes itself from both Necromancer and by Warlock by having a Reaper form mechanic where you turn into a Reaper, and then if your Reaper's health goes to 0, you become a human again. So it's kind of like having 2 health bars. It's very exciting. It's a very dynamic form of play. Lots of leech that goes into the character as well. And it's been a fan favorite for a very long time. There are lots of builds with Lich, and lots of them are very good. In fact, when I make build guides, I don't distinguish Lich builds. I just say Lich is S tier because they're all kind of the same because they're all very, very strong. So what we'll be recommending this time is something with a bleed Lich. Crit Lich is very popular, but Crit Lich is something that I recommended in my last new player starter build video, and variety is the spice of life. So we're going to recommend something different this time around. I'm going to recommend Bleed Lich because Bleed Overload is a node that exists, or it's a function of a node that exists in the Warlock mastery, and Warlock's brand new. So this is a Lich build scaling Bleed using the Bleed Overload from the Warlock skill tree, and we'll be scaling Bleed with Rip Blood and with Transplant. It's kind of a throwback to a classic build. It's very new player friendly. You should be able to get damage very quickly, and it'll be fun. For our idols, we'll be scaling cooldown recovery speed, and our gear will be scaling cooldown recovery speed, and Transplant will be a bunch of our damage, so we would just Goomba Stomp and jump on top of an enemy's head with our Reaper Form turned on, with Death Seal turned on, to deal a bunch of bleed damage. I have no doubt that this will be good. It might have a pseudo auto bomber. I really shouldn't say that word. It might have a pseudo auto bomber playstyle to it, given that Rip Blood is something that will proc automatically as you run through the map while you have Bleed Overload. That sounds like an exciting thing to do. And this should be a very simple build and a very simple introduction to a Death Seal Reaper Form Lich if you've never played it before. And even if you have, it'll still be quite fun. For our second mastery here, we will be talking about Necromancer. If you follow my content before, you know that I personally don't really like minion builds, but I have played all these builds and I feel like they're appropriate things for you. My recommendation here is going to be based on like a skeleton army kind of thing, because when I think about Necromancer players, I suspect that they want things with a bunch of minions following them around and not necessarily one big minion. If you're in the mood for one big minion, fear not, there's lots of good options, because you'll be using something called Dreadshade, and Dreadshade has support for one big minion in it. If you like that playstyle, things like Summon Abomination, or maybe things like Solo Archmage, using something that people colloquially refer to as like Fred or Roid Mage, you might hear those terms thrown around. For us, we'll be playing a very beginner-friendly build that did get buffed in the patch notes, a little bit of extra crit chance, a little bit of extra more damage multipliers in our skill tree, so that always feels good when giving out a beginner build recommendation to new players. So this will be scaling fire damage. We'll be converting both our skeletons to archers and fire damage archers. We'll be converting our skeleton mages into fire damage mages, and we'll scale fire damage. Fire damage crits, plus levels to fire damage minions, plus crit for fire damage minions, things along those lines. At some point, if you wanted to min-max this, there's lots of options for you. You could pivot to different builds. You could pivot to a different element and skill cold damage if there's unique items or set items that you find instead. And this will get you up and running very quickly. So this is something that, it's a minion build. I'm not really in love with minion builds. I did find 2 other minion builds in other masteries that I personally enjoyed more than this, but if you really like playing a Necromancer, you're going to like the Necromancer in Last Epoch. I do feel like there's 2 different subtypes of Necromancers in Last Epoch, in case you haven't heard this explanation before. I do feel like you'll have typical stuff that looks like this, that appeals to a wide range of audience of people who haven't played Last Epoch before, and the Necromancer builds that I personally tend to like a little bit more kind of feel like Rube Goldberg devices, where like this thing dies and it procs this thing and this thing explodes, but it procs 2 of these other minions to summon and then they cast spells on each other. I think those are more exciting. It's the kind of minion build that I might personally enjoy. But if you want something that's like stock standard, very simple to put together for a new player, just having a swarm of minions following around you, it does well to fulfill the fantasy of playing a Necromancer, and it does well in the game too. Rounding out the last of our 3 masteries here for Acolyte, we'll be talking about Warlock. Warlock is a brand new addition to Last Epoch as of 1.0, launching on Wednesday. It's also maybe a 75% chance or so that I will also be playing a Warlock when I begin streaming Wednesday afternoon live on twitch.tv. So I look forward to probably playing this exact build. I'll be scaling Chthonic Fissure, however you pronounce it. It's a skill that puts out a rift on the ground and shoots out tormented spirits, and those spirits apply the curse Torment to our enemies. We'll be scaling Torment damage, which means we are scaling spell, damage over time, and necrotic damage. We might also be building some necrotic resistance, because we get a lot of necrotic resistance by default, and that will scale into making our Torment curse deal even more damage. As we scale necrotic resistance, we'll also be getting some ward decay threshold, ward decay, yeah, I think it's called threshold, from our mastery. And if we can get some unique items later on, we can even get ward per second based on how much necrotic resistance we have. So it seems like that's a good place to be, scaling both offense and defense at the same time. I'm looking forward to it. Oftentimes, in the world of Last Epoch, we kind of make fun of, maybe poke fun at set items. Set items aren't always living up to the fantasy of being something that I want to use. However, for this build, especially for leveling's build, there might be some stuff that you keep an eye out for. Keep an eye out for this Sinathia set. It is a mace, a one-handed mace, and a shield. They give you plus levels to curses along with some flat damage. It should be quite good for leveling, especially early on, and they're pretty common items, so it's likely that you'll find one on the ground. Another one is the Isadora set. The Isadora set has synergy with Damn, which is not exactly what we're doing, but while you're leveling, all damage is good damage, so Damn, you might as well include it. Also, the Isadora belt has been a long time excellent leveling item. It provides cast speed and also percent armor and flat armor. And having that much armor on the Isadora belt while leveling gives you a ton of defense against all the small hits, all the physical hits of the monsters as you're running through the campaign and even through like normal monoliths. Should be good. Moving on to our next starting class, we're going to talk about rogue stuff, and we'll start out with Falconer. Falconer is brand new to the game, and my build planner got deleted. Hold on a second. All right, that's better. So for our Falconer build, we're going to be recommending a Shadow Dagger build, which is a bold choice based on the past couple years of how Shadow Daggers are really good. Shadow Daggers are very, very strong, and there's a reason that you see so many recommendations for building up Shadow Daggers. I think Falconer could be a lot of fun to experiment with, making the Falcon deal a lot of damage, scaling bleed damage, scaling the Falcon's bird damage off of things like Dive Bomb, scaling Falcon strikes from Falconry. All of those sound very exciting, but as a starter build, I want to give you something that I think would be excellent to get you up and running with the build, and then once you get your character like level 70 or 80 or wherever you want to be, you can experiment with other stuff, because just getting to 70 and 80, we'll take something that's stock standard, that's guaranteed to work, and then if you want to experiment with other stuff later on, I think that would be a great time to pivot. So my recommendation is Shadow Daggers, because they got nerfed by 24%, and they're still totally busted. I have no doubt that Shadow Daggers will remain a mainstay in the rogue meta, that people will play them and continue to have fun with them because they're kind of absurd. They auto crit, they scale off of throwing damage and melee damage at the same time, and they're applied off of our Umbral blades, and we need to use a dagger for this build, so that's very important. And we need to be spec'd into both aerial assault, which will drop some Umbral blades behind us, and Umbral blades making sure that they apply our Shadow Daggers. You could change this build to be something that focuses more on throwing attack speed, in case you wanted to put down a smoke bomb and then scale throwing attack speed, throw as many of these as possible, because that's a nice way of scaling damage. This build is focused more on just proccing Umbral blades off of our aerial assault, having them explode behind us, having them apply tons of damage. This will be a very popular build. There is no doubt in my mind that many, many people will be playing this. I've put a lot of dexterity onto the gear, first because dexterity is a good thing to have. It scales lots of good stats for us, but also because one of the popular ways of making Shadow Daggers deal even more damage late game is to use the relatively common unique item called Morning Frost. So that pivot point is already built into the planner. Otherwise, dexterity is just a generically good stat. If you don't want dexterity, you could always do something like vitality on your gear instead. But frankly, Shadow Daggers are strong enough that no matter which direction you want to take it, you're going to have a good time, because they auto crit and they deal tons of damage, and holy moly, they're still very strong. As long as we're still in the world of rogue, let's talk about Bladedancer. Bladedancer along with Marksman, they're already in the game, they're not brand new, but we're going to recommend something that's slightly different here, something slightly off the beaten path. Many people in my Discord community and on Twitch also like this build. It's a good one. It's also great because it's not Shadow Daggers. If you want to take Shadow Daggers, Umbral Blades, and play the same build and use it as a Bladedancer, you'll be proccing it off of Shift instead of using Aerial Assault, of course, because you don't have a bird with you. It's excellent. It's really, really strong, and people love it. However, variety is the spice of life. So we're going to recommend something slightly different so that you at least have an option to play something else as a beginner build. The beginner build that we're doing here is Shadow Cascade. Shadow Cascade is a flashy and fun skill that you can use pretty early in the game as soon as you get it. Sorry, as soon as you get like 5 points into the base tree for a Bladedancer. And you can proc it off of Shift. You can manually cast it, but nobody manually casts a skin. Pretty much everyone casts it off of Shift. It's been a fan favorite for a long time, but what's interesting here is that we're not using Shatter Daggers at all. We are purely scaling melee crit damage. We are dual wielding swords. We are not using Shatter Daggers. We are not using Umbral Blades. And this build is tried and true. We'll have a YouTube video on it as well if you'd like to see what a min-max version of could be. But it's very, very good. It's a fun playstyle, and it's a nice little rebellion against the Shatter Daggers that are everywhere because there's, oh my god, there's so many Shatter Dagger builds, and could we please just have something else to try instead? Here, try this one. It's really fun. Rounding out the rogue starting class, we'll be talking about Marksman here. Shout out to Volka from the maxroll.gg team for coming up with this idea and sharing it in the release video for Falconer, and teasing Zizarin with it as well, because it looks cool as hell. You should know that the footage you're seeing on the screen is bugged slightly. That's shooting too many arrows, but that shouldn't matter too much. This still looks awesome. It still looks like something that I would be recommending to lots of Path of Exile Andes who are interested in playing something that kind of looks like Tornado Shot just a little bit. So Marksman doesn't have the best skills right now. There's not too many things that I would recommend in the world of Marksman. I love Hail of Arrows. Personally, it's quite a good build, but it doesn't appeal to people who are just brand new to the game, because when someone says, I want to play a bow build, what I think they're trying to say is, I want to play Tornado Shot. So Hail of Arrows is a great build. I've recommended it in the past. It's great. But this build is new. It's flashy. It looks cool as hell. And it, I think, fits the fantasy of what people may be looking for just a little bit closer. Eventually, I would transition this build from being a lightning damage build to being a cold damage build. You gain a couple benefits, such as freezing enemies periodically. And you also get to use the unique item, Rain of Winter, which has been a mainstay in a build called Bow Mage for a very long time. One thing to know, if you've played this game a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years ago and haven't logged in a while, you should know that crit vulnerability has been changed. Crit vulnerability has a cap these days, and there's a new affix for bows that you ought to know about. Bows have an affix for, it's a hybrid prefix, for bow attack speed and base critical strike chance, so it's plus additive, which is very, very good. If you want to transition into the Rain of Winter version of this build, I would highly recommend farming up a 1 LP version of the Rain of Winter and trying to slam that base critical strike chance onto it. You could play without, but you really want that base crit. Base crits, it's something that you really need if you're actually trying to scale crit on something like this. So before you get the 1 LP, before you get the Rain of Winter, just scaling lightning damage and using a normal looking bow seems awesome. This build is going to be popular. There's no way that it's not. It looks simply too cool. We are done talking about the rogue, so let's move on to talking about Sentinel builds. The very first thing we're talking about is Paladin, and there's a couple notes here. Remember that in 1.0, there's a brand new skill, an old skill that just got a brand new skill tree called Healing Hands. And Healing Hands, personally, is very, very exciting. I love the idea of Healing Hands, and it's very fun to brainstorm different things to do with Healing Hands. Do you proc it? Do you cast it? Do you turn it into a melee skill? Do you channel it? Do you do something else with it? Seems very fun to think about. If you're into experimenting, I highly recommend experimenting with Healing Hands. It looks awesome. However, you're watching this video, you want something that's tried and true, and what better tried and true than the old spin to win? This build recommendation comes from Dread. Dread has played 100 times more Warpath than I have in the past, and I have played just a small bit of it to know that I'm not the biggest fan of spin to win, but I do like strong builds. So here we go. This is a spell crit spin to win build. As a paladin, we'll be scaling primarily the AoE proc from our Holy Aura, so like the big flame burst proc there. We will be scaling spell damage, spell crit, crit multi, things along those lines. And for single target damage, we're going to spec into Smite. Smite is going to proc while we are using our Warpath. So everything about this build is quite automatic. I've played this build, I've seen this build, I know that its performance is quite good, and it's also very easy to get up and running at the very beginning of the game. Speaking of the beginning of the game, there's a unique item that you ought to know about that will give you Leech early and often, and it will make your life very easy until you get a spell Leech blessing or a different source of Leech later in the game. That is to say, when you are in the second area of the game, the void area of the game, and you're in the council's chamber, there's a side quest where you either turn in a, what's the word for it? The ledger. You either turn in Ezra's ledger to Ezra himself, or you give it to the gambler. Oftentimes you give it to the gambler because he gives you Gambler's Fallacy, the amulet that gives you a little bit of health gain on crits, and it got like some crit multi stuff going on there. However, for your build, if you're playing this, I recommend turning that Ezra's Ledger back into Ezra. He will give you a pair of gloves that have elemental resistance on them and elemental damage leached as health. So that tiny bit of LE leech will carry you a nice long way. until you get some Leech from a different source, probably from a Leech Blessing. So that's my recommendation for early gearing. If you want to see a better version of this build, or maybe a min-maxed version of this build, I will link in the description of this video. Also to Dread's video where he details what an endgame spell, crit, Warpath, Smite, Paladin build could look like. Making our way through the Sentinel Mastery, we're going to talk about Forge Guard next. Forge Guard, I think, is a totally appropriate power level for a brand new player. If you're an expert player, I'm not sure if Forge Guard's where you want to be, but for a new player, I think it's totally fine. Also, it has a nice fantasy along with it, with these floating forged weapons. They kind of look like lightsabers following you around, and we're going to be scaling their damage. So it's a minion build. We have no Manifest Armor in this build, and we have no Warpath in this build, so it's a bit of a more active playstyle, which to me seems great. I have leveled this character, and I've played this character, and I found myself having a lot of fun, so I'm happy to recommend it here to you. One item to take a look out for is one particular set item, not the entire set, just the helmet. It's called Sun Forged Great Helm. You get this thing, gives you flat health regeneration per forged weapon that you have active, and it's a nice little form of sustain. Shout out to Master Sword from Twitch and Discord and YouTube, everywhere that he interacts with me. He recommended this build, and it seems excellent. The last of the 3 masteries that we'll be talking about when it comes to Sentinel is Void Knight. And I don't think Void Knight is one of the best masteries in the game, but I do think it's one of the most fun masteries in the game. It is so cool. We are not scaling void damage here. We are not auto-bombing. We're not casting spells. We're not playing Devouring Orb. We're playing a good build instead. This is Rive. This is physical damage Rive. I'm a huge fan of this, and I've got a YouTube video if you'd like to see a more endgame version of it. Basically, what we're doing is using a big two-handed weapon. We're smacking people. We'd like to have some ignites because those ignites get consumed and they turn into physical damage penetration. This is excellent for us because we're scaling phys damage. We also have a brand new node from the patch notes called Scrap Metal that turns these superfluous forged weapons into something that we can actually use, both more armor and more damage for our physical damage two-handed melee Void Knight character here. If you want a more offensive or more defensive version of this build, they're both available. It's basically a toggle in the nodes that you're adding into the Forge Guard Mastery, but that's for a different time. This build is awesome, and I totally recommend it to you. We are done talking about Sentinel builds, and we are now talking about Primalist builds, which to me is very exciting, basically because personally I'm very excited for using Gathering Storm. So our first mastery here is Druid. We're going to do an update to the Lightning Bug build that I played in the past. Lightning, Tornado procs, running around in Swarmblade build, looking like a bug, looking like Scyther. It's a lot of fun, and I've played that build, but this build is updated because those lightning procs are now using Gathering Storm's Stormbolt. So we need to spec into Gathering Storm, grab the moral multipliers there, build around the mechanics of that skill, and then incorporate that into the rest of our Swarmblade character. A couple things to keep in mind. This is the most speculative build that I will be recommending because I haven't technically played it because it's brand new in 1.0. But in terms of gearing, this planner might have too much % increased crit. We might have too much crit. So you'll have to play that one by ear. You are definitely not lacking crit in any way, but I want to be crit capped at 100%, but I also don't want to waste affixes. So there might be some min-maxing for you, which also fits the theme of the rest of these videos, or the rest of these builds that I'm recommending to you. These are very solid ideas. They're not min-maxed. This one might just have too much crit because we have a lot of crit. Feels good. We talked about Druid, let's talk about Shaman. There are lots of speculative Shaman builds that I would love to try out personally, including mostly Gathering Storm stuff. But let's try the stock standard one. This is a excellent build guide. If you want to see an end game version of it, I'm going to point you over to Bina's YouTube channel. He has lots of coverage on this. It's Thorn Totem. So we are turning Thorn Totem into something that we cast while in Spriggan form. We are trimming off all the extra thorns and only having one big thorn, because instead of giving 150% increased cast speed, it gives 100% cast speed, but it's still really, really good. So this is stock standard territory. It's one of the best starters that you could possibly choose, and it's quite fast once you get unique items for it. Before you get unique items for it, you're basically just running around. You have haste, you have some movement speed, you'll be fine. But you're lacking movement skill until you get extra unique items later on. I am sure that many people will be playing this, and I'm sure that many people will have fun with it too. We've talked about Druid and Shaman, so let's round out the rest of Primalist by talking about Beastmaster. If you know my content, or if you listen to this video, you know that I'm not really that big on minion builds, which was surprising because this build is a minion build, and this one feels really good. This is a wolf, summon wolf build We are not using squirrels or anything, even if you can transition to that later on. This is a starter video, so we're starting with just wolves and no unique items. This comes at the recommendation of Dread. Dread has played lots of summon wolf builds in the past as well, and this is very fun. I was surprised. This doesn't really feel like a minion build. You are in the thick of it. You are attacking monsters. You're attacking with swipe. You have relevant damage as well. It's not only your minions. You can defend yourself against monsters. It's not only your minions, but also your Fury Leap pulls your minions along with you. And just having that quality of life, man, it feels so, so good. So this is a minion build that has the Perry stamp of approval on it. It's fun. It doesn't fail. It doesn't feel like it has the pitfalls of normal minion builds. It's active. It's melee. I have my own damage as well. My own sustain is quite good. I like it. I'm going to link Dread's YouTube video on this topic as well if you want to see a more min-maxed version of it. But just as a starter build, I think this is really nice, and it looks quite easy to put together, especially with all the new minion affixes that we have in the game too. So that brings us to our next starting class, which is Mage. And Mage, we're going to pause for a moment because there's 3 masteries, technically. One of them is Spellblade, which has a couple good builds you can play. It doesn't have that much cool stuff going on because it's a little bit old. It's got like 5 good builds, not 100 good builds, but it's still fine, and I'm going to recommend stuff for it. Runemaster is awesome, and I'm going to recommend stuff for it too. Sorc is fine. Sorc is totally fine in terms of power level. You didn't brick your build if you clicked Sorc. Don't worry about it. I don't think that it's particularly interesting. I think it's a little bit boring. I think it's outdated and completely overshadowed by Runemaster in pretty much every way. And I don't know what to recommend for it. You can play Glacier if you want. Crit Glacier. It's awesome. Go do it. It's the same build as it was 5 years ago, for the most part. So... even Forge Guard, which is like a little bit on the weaker end, and all of us, especially me, I really enjoy making fun of Forge Guard, but at least Forge Guard has like an interesting fantasy to it. You have this minion stuff, you have these lightsabers that follow you around, the forged weapons, the build that I recommended, and it's cool. Sorc is fine in terms of power level, a bit boring, a bit old. It doesn't have any fantasy to it. It doesn't have any cohesion. It doesn't really have anything interesting. The identity of Sorc is supposed to be is big mana cost equals slightly increased damage. My recommendation is don't play a Sorc. On the other hand, we're going to move forward and talk about Spellblade next. Spellblade is like the melee attack speed, sorcerer kind of guy. Some of the builds are melee damage and some of the builds deal spell damage, but I'm going to be recommending a Frostbite Shatter Strike character. There's a number of different directions you can take with Shatter Strike. I went back and forth for a while recommending either crit or Frostbite or crit or Frostbite, but I think my recommendation here is going to be Frostbite because it has a lot of overlap with the other build I'm going to recommend for Runemaster. Spoilers. But even without the Frostbite unique items, the gloves, and the boots that you'll undoubtedly want to have for a character like this, you can still scale armor shred % chance, and then using the Runemaster skill tree, convert all of that armor shred chance into Frostbite. Normally, Frostbite builds tend to be gated by unique items, but for a mage, because you have the armor shred stuff, and you also have class affixes and idols that all get you to a good amount of to a good amount of Frostbite chance, you can actually play Frostbite without those unique items for quite a long time, even though you will end up wanting them in the long run. So this build planner will have elemental damage over time and % cold damage on the gear. Once you start min-maxing your characters, once you get something like Snowdrift boots, you'll want to pivot. You want to replace those % cold damage with freeze rate multiplier instead. So once you make these changes to your character and start min-maxing, you'll have to change some of the affixes in order to make your build even better. So this build has lots of room to grow, but for a starter, it's also great. And the very last mastery of the very last class and the very last build of this video will be a fan favorite. This will be Frostbite, Frostclaw, Runemaster. Technically nerfed in one way, I guess. Technically nerfed in another way, I guess, in Rowan's Frostguard and the defenses to this. If I were in charge, I might have made some different changes to this build, but it seems like it's basically the same as it used to be, which means extraordinarily strong and an excellent recommendation for somebody who wants to play Runemaster. So you could play a flashy Runemaster build, and there's lots of them. There's lots of fun experimentation to do with new buffed runic invocations and new unique items that support Runemaster stuff, but I really like Frostbite Frostclaw, and it's giga strong. So I'm going to continue recommending it here as well. It's kind of wild to me that we're about to have the 1.0 launch of this game. I've been playing Last Epoch for about 3 years at this point. You've been playing Last Epoch for an indiscriminate amount of time, but it's finally here. So we have Warlock, we have Falconer, we have Shaman getting updated with Gathering Storm and Tempest Strike. We have Healing Hands finally getting a skill tree. We have factions, we have corruption rebalances, we have new items, uniques, class affixes. We have a game that's online that has trade in it. We have multiplayer. We have all these things. Hopefully the servers handle it well. I hope. I do plan on doing a build contest in the future around March 8th. You'll certainly see more information coming about that in the future for me. You know, Twitch drops are happening on February 22nd, one day after launch. You can watch me or you can watch 600 other people who also have Twitch drops enabled on their channel. There's lots of places where you can get that free cosmetic. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a ton of fun. I'll see you there. It's kind of wild to me that we're about to have the 1.0 launch of this game. I've been playing Last Epoch for about 3 years at this point. You've been playing Last Epoch for an indeterminate amount of time, but it's finally here. So we have Warlock, we have Falconer, we have Shaman getting updated with Gathering Storm and Tempest Strike. We have Healing Hands finally getting a skill tree. We have factions, we have corruption rebalances, we have new items, uniques, class affixes. We have a game that's online that has trade in it. We have multiplayer. We have all these things. Hopefully the servers handle it well. I hope. I do plan on doing a build contest in the future around March 8th. You'll certainly see more information coming about that in the future for me. You know, Twitch drops are happening on February 22nd, one day after launch. You can watch me or you can watch 600 other people who also have Twitch drops enabled on their channel. There's lots of places where you can get that free cosmetic. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a ton of fun. I'll see you there.